Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Tabatha Bull, the president and CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business. Tabatha is Anishinaabe and a member of Nipissing First Nation in Ontario. Her leadership has been widely recognized, and she was named CEO of the Year in 2022 by the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women in 2023, and has been recognized as the top 100 lobbyist in Canada for 4 years in a row. Tabatha also sits on the Prime Minister's Council on Canada-U.S. relations. Tabatha, thanks so much for being with us on the show this week.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Well, we're taping the show on February 24th, so we're going to try and talk tariffs here, knowing that things could be happening on March 4th, the day we air. And, you know, we had you on the newscast shortly after, I think, the tariffs were paused. You saw it as a reprieve and a time to get our house in order. Has that been happening?
I think definitely if we look at interprovincial trade barriers, we've seen a lot of movement on that, which has been excellent. Still work to do, but definitely those conversations from what we've been seeing and hearing, we've seen some movement across different provinces and from the federal government as well. I think, you know, there's more for us to do in how are we investing here in Canada and moving forward on projects, on, you know, starting to have those conversations and ensuring the right people are at the table. But, you know, as we've been talking about the uncertainty of what's coming from the South, it's very hard to plan when you're not sure what's going to be coming at you.
I guess, you know, despite all the uncertainty and what could be difficult economic times coming, did some good come out of this in terms of like the interprovincial trade, opening up our own borders?
Yeah, I think, you know, in every crisis, there's an opportunity, and it's an opportunity for us to really look at us as Canada and as a nation, to look at the businesses that exist here, to look at how we can strengthen business supply chains within Canada. I think it's also really has brought some Canadian pride to many to really think about how are we working together. And that's both from politically across provinces and territories and with the federal government, but also as business leaders, you know, really looking at how can we be supporting supply chains, buying Canadian, buying Indigenous. A lot of that discussion has really amplified some of the businesses that exist here. And the hockey game win didn't hurt either. Right. I think you saw Canadians really come together there, but we really need to keep up that momentum and discussion and continue to push for finding opportunities here at home.
Yeah, are there other things that we haven't touched on that can be done here at home to lessen the blow?
Yeah, I think we really need to look at regulatory barriers on development of projects. I think that definitely includes starting conversations much earlier with respect to Indigenous communities and resources. There's been a lot of conversation about critical minerals, and we need to continue to remind everyone that's talking about critical minerals that the communities in which those minerals exist and those territories need to be at the table. And those conversations have to start now. And that's the same with the conversation that's been had on getting energy to the East Coast. You know, we saw what happened in 2017. Indigenous communities needed to be at the table and be part of those conversations. So I think a lot more work has to be done in that space. I don't think those conversations are happening to the extent that they need to be happening yet. And I think, you know, but we have moved on some things like equity loan guarantees for Indigenous communities to be part of those projects. You know, it's really great to see that that's been launched, but still work to do. And I think the political uncertainty that's happening across the province federally, but also, you know, here where I am in Ontario, in an election right now, has definitely slowed some of that progress that we might have been able to have otherwise.
Yeah, a lot going on politically here in Canada as well. I guess just briefly on another thing that's come up in the last 24 hours, and that's Trump talking about reviving what many have called the zombie pipeline, Keystone XL. Any thoughts on that talk?
I think it's very interesting that you would bring back that conversation while you're also going to tariff the commodity that's going to flow through that pipeline. So, as with a number of things that have come out from President Trump lately, it's difficult to understand the rationale and the thought on that. But, you know, that conversation, and for our cousins and Indigenous people in the South right now, south of the border in the U.S., it's frightening, and because I really think that they're moving backwards in their respective rights, and I don't know that he's prepared for what the response will be.
Right. As we've spoken about before, sectors that could be targeted include those where Indigenous businesses and workers are very active, things like oil and gas, forestry, mining. What have you been hearing from them over the past month?
Yeah, so definitely, as we said before when we discussed, we know that Indigenous businesses are higher represented in areas of mining, forestry, oil and gas, but also Indigenous workers as well. So specifically, in forestry in Saskatchewan, I think it's about 20% of the workers who are Indigenous. So definitely concern, and specifically in forestry and lumber, when there already is a tariff, if there's an additional tariff on top of the softwood lumber tariff that already exists, that's going to have an immediate impact on those businesses and also on the communities that have equity positions in those projects as well. So that's where, here at home, we need to ensure that any retaliatory tariffs that happen are really, there's a lot of consideration put into what the impact will be on Canadian businesses in those spaces. And I think that is happening, but it never hurts to continue to remind people. And if there are supports or investment that's provided into those economies, that we ensure that, those are able to reach the Indigenous businesses and communities that rely on those sectors as well.
Yeah, another place would be Northern Ontario, where First Nations hold a lot of forestry licenses. When I lived and worked in Northern Ontario, the softwood lumber dispute was a big thing. We saw sawmills, paper mills felt like they were shutting down in the small towns every month. Good paying jobs lost there. Are we at risk of those types of job losses and shutdowns, do you think?
Yeah, I think there is. I think even, we've seen some news out of Northern Ontario already with some lumber mills that are just kind of getting started and looking at where their customers are. And I think this uncertainty that we're facing right now is also impacting investment. So investors, not being as willing to invest in projects and get projects in new territories off the ground as well. Just that uncertainty of where the customer base is going to be. And we've seen and heard from some businesses out west as well in forestry that, they had customers lined up in the U.S. and real concern about where they're going to be able to deliver the lumber that they have been processing there. So I think for sure in Northern Ontario, that's going to be an impact. And those businesses were already impacted by the softwood lumber tariffs as well. So it'll be interesting to see how that will happen. How long those tariffs will be in place. I don't know that the U.S. has really considered or understood what the price and how that impact will have on the price of housing in the U.S. Because they are really reliant on the lumber that comes from Canada. So, still our whole plan is that we can avoid tariffs altogether. But if they do come in, how do we ensure that they're as short a time as possible?
There's been talk of supports and programs similar or on the scale of what we had during the pandemic. Has there been much in the way of support for Indigenous businesses in light of this tariff threat?
So there hasn't been much conversation on what those supports will look like. I think what we will be really concerned about and ensuring that we're on top of is that any supports that do roll out, Indigenous businesses are eligible to apply to those. And I think we may have talked about this before, but during COVID, a number of the programs that came out, Indigenous businesses were not able to apply, either because they didn't already have a bank relationship with one of the major 5 banks, For economic development corporations, at time the wage subsidy that came out, you couldn't have a community as a shareholder, and we know that economic development corporations are purposely set up that way because they are required to be because of the Indian Act. So those were things we needed to get changed later, but they resulted in a delay of over a month of support for those businesses. So it's really important that we're at the table when those supports, whatever they are going to be, are designed so that we can ensure that they meet the needs of Indigenous businesses out of the gate.
Tabatha, much more to talk about here, a little bit more on the tariffs, and then of course the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business as well and the work you do there. We just need to step aside for a quick break, but there's more to come. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Tabatha Bull, the President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Relations, or business, sorry, and we've been discussing the potential impact of Donald Trump's tariffs here. And Tabatha, you sit on the Prime Minister's Council on Canada-U.S. relations. How important is it to have Indigenous representation there?
I think it's important to have Indigenous representation at every table.
Right.
This table, I'm really there representing business and our members, but also Indigenous business and Indigenous economies. There are many other tables of conversations that are happening. And, at that table, it's also an opportunity for me to remind everyone else that they need to be talking to Indigenous elected leaders and having conversations around Indigenous rights. And just reminding them that I'm not there to speak on behalf of the rights of people and territories in which they may want to do business. I'm there to really represent a business and economy perspective. And there's, not very often that Indigenous people have been invited to these tables. So when we get the opportunity to be there, it's really important that we do so. Part of the role that I've been trying to also do is reach out to Indigenous business leaders, both our members, but also Indigenous businesses that I know are heavily involved in sectors that will be impacted, to get their input, understand, what more can we be doing, and raise those issues both at that table and others. The other benefit is, there are influential people around the table. So the council, is 18 of us. And if I can, get them also thinking about how are we representing Indigenous rights in this conversation, and are we considering the impact on Indigenous people in these conversations, and get them saying those things as well, that's a benefit for being at the table also.
Well, we wanted to talk about tariffs, but we don't know how much is going to change in the half hour that this show's on. So we wanted to talk about the council itself, which just celebrated its 40th year. You have 2,500 members, 1,300 Indigenous businesses represented. Can you tell us a bit about who is represented there?
Sure. So we have, we just celebrated our 40th anniversary, as you said. Our membership is growing. I think we're about 2,700 now. So nice. Every month continues to grow. And our membership does consist of Indigenous and non-Indigenous businesses. About 65-70% of our membership is Indigenous business, and they are in every sector, every size, every province and territory across the country. And non-Indigenous businesses as well, from the major banks to every sector, transportation, energy. More recently, we've seen growth in areas like IT, with Google, Uber, travel and tourism with Air Canada. So a real growth across the board in both like sectorally, but also size. And same when we think about Indigenous business, just Indigenous business growth in Canada, growing across in every sector. So a lot of growth recently in IT and innovation for Indigenous businesses. So that it's been incredible to see the growth of the organization and the membership. And part of that is really, both non-Indigenous businesses wanting to understand how they can better work with Indigenous people, bringing Indigenous businesses into their supply chain, employment of Indigenous people, and what their role is under TRC 92 as businesses in Canada, and just the growth of Indigenous business and Indigenous entrepreneurism and innovation in the country. And our role, back 40 years ago was really to support growing the Indigenous economy and Indigenous entrepreneurs, and how corporate Canada could help play a role in that at the time. That's still our mission. But through that, we've been able to develop a number of other new programs. Procurement has been a key focus of ours for close to 10 years now, both advocating for minimum 5% procurement from Government of Canada and other governments, but also in corporate supply chains as well. And we've seen progress there. And a lot of the work, all the work that we do is backed by the research. So we have a research team that looks at Indigenous economies and understands barriers to Indigenous businesses, both here in Canada and across the globe. And all of that research helps inform the programs that we do, but also helps us in our advocacy and lobbying work, both in Ottawa and across the country.
Obviously, you haven't been with the council for 40 years, but is there something that sticks out over that time as a real game changer for Indigenous business?
Partially during COVID, and I think also, in Kamloops, when they confirmed the graves, people in Canada really woke up to things that they should have been aware of for many, many years. And it's still disheartening that some people feel or can say that they didn't know these things happened in our country. But I think that people have really woken up. And during COVID, people really started to understand that there were significant economic gaps in our country. As great of a country as Canada is, there are people who live below the poverty line, who don't have clean water, who don't have infrastructure. And I think people started to understand that. And that's where we saw government and corporations start to really understand that they have a responsibility as Canadians and as Canadian corporations. And to understand that everything they've been built on has been built on land that does belong to Indigenous people. So that's really been a change, just in the interest again of what better can we be doing, and that's really opened opportunities for us to support Indigenous business through that lens. And then I think also pride of Indigenous people. And, we have some members who still say that they have two different business cards, one that says they're Indigenous business and one that doesn't, because there are meetings that they go into that they're still faced with racism as an Indigenous business. So we have a lot of work to do to continue to push that and change that narrative. And I'm seeing that change. So I think since I've been there in 2018, we've definitely seen change there. And then also the opportunity to be at tables like we discussed, the opportunity that we've been to sit in Senate committee and House of Commons committee when they're talking about business in Canada and talking about economy, to really want to understand what's the impact on Indigenous business and economy. That's been a shift change as well, that there is a recognition that we are part of the growing economy and we need to be at the table. And that's really helped us to change programs and to advocate for change and support for Indigenous businesses.
Yeah, a lot of businesses struggled, obviously, during the pandemic, but continue to post-pandemic. How would you say that the state overall of Indigenous businesses right now?
We're definitely still seeing growth in the Indigenous economy, both Indigenous businesses being created at 5 to 9 times the rate of non-Indigenous businesses in Canada. We definitely lost a lot of businesses during the pandemic, but not as much as we would have thought or were worried about. We're still seeing those businesses come out of recovery and just getting to recovery, and that's why this economic potential uncertainty is concerning. But I definitely would say that we're still seeing growth, and we are seeing areas of innovation and areas where those businesses are working together as well. So bringing another Indigenous business into your supply chain and starting to rebuild that circular economy that we saw in the past before settlers arrived.
You mentioned procurement, and I definitely want to get to that, Tabatha.
Yeah.
We just have to step aside for one last quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Tabatha Bull, the President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business. And Tabatha, I wanted to talk about procurement as you brought it up there. Earlier this season on the show, we had investigative reporter Patty Sontag on the show, who I'm sure you know has been looking into the federal government's Indigenous procurement. Not too many good things came out of that, of course. What was happening there was some lax verification. Non-Indigenous businesses were taking advantage of the process. So what's your take on the federal procurement program?
I think, the 5% minimum target and having a program is essential for us to ensure that the government is procuring from Indigenous business. So it's a bit concerning, because definitely through the investigations, we have found people taking advantage of that process. But I think people take advantage of every procurement process and every RFP. That's business. And we see that in business everywhere. Definitely there needs to be more stringent requirements around the definitions, around meeting the definitions, and also requirements for recertifying. So, what I understand part of the issue was not just in the initial certification part, but that every year there wasn't a requirement to attest that nothing had changed within your business. And at CCIB, we do certification as well, but every year, as part of our membership, people have to attest that shareholders haven't changed, that percentage of ownership or control has not changed. And we also do an audit of our members to ensure that that's the case. And I don't believe that was happening either at the federal government level. And there are, definitely people who will take advantage of the system, and we've seen that. I think what was missing in those reports were the number of successful Indigenous businesses that have benefited from the PSIB program at the federal government. There were definitely a number of issues, but we know that there are a significant number of members who have benefited, Indigenous businesses who are now a supplier who do the kitchens in submarines under a defense contract. Another business who's owned by an Indigenous community that has a large defense contract. And that's specifically supporting not just a business, but a community and community services. And I think we need to spend some time highlighting those actual benefits, because my concern is that a new government would come in and choose to scrap the whole program. And there was a lot of people long before my time who pushed for a program such as that.
Right.
But we definitely know that those people who are taking advantage, there needs to be penalties to that. And like there would be anywhere, if you were a scaffolding business and didn't have a license to do scaffolding, that you wouldn't get a procurement the next time. And I think that we need to be a little bit, see more stringent penalties on those that have taken advantage.
Absolutely. We mentioned in the intro some of your honors you've received in recent years. CEO of the Year in 2022 by the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women in 2023. What led you down the path to pushing for Indigenous business?
I'm an engineer by training, and I did electrical engineering and worked with communities, First Nation and Métis councils all across Ontario for 5-6 years on energy projects. I loved that work, and I traveled all over the province working on community energy planning and on equity projects with communities. And we were really supportive, and a lot of that work was changing in policy. And I kind of got to a point in my career where I felt like that's what I had set out to do, and I wanted to do more and do more on a national basis as well. I had always enjoyed CCIB's events and felt really inspired by the work they did and the entrepreneurs that they were celebrating. So made the move over to CCIB in 2018. And I so firmly believe in the opportunity that we can build an Indigenous economy through business, and that's both through procurement, but through supporting entrepreneurs, both in bringing investment and building economies for self-determination and prosperity within community, but also in the incredible opportunity that it allows for our youth to see Indigenous success and business success, and see Indigenous business people being at tables that we've not been at before. So not just supporting business, but also, really pushing corporate Canada to have Indigenous people on their boards and in executive leadership roles, and being able to showcase those leaders that are really making a difference. It's inspiring. I have 2 boys, and it's really always been important to me that all the work I do is making a difference. So makes it much easier to go to work every day when you know that you're making a difference.
Good stuff, Tabatha. So much we didn't get to. We didn't even get to talk about Bear's Lair, but I'm sure we'll be seeing you again here pretty soon with all that's going on. Thanks so much for being with us on the show this week.
Thank you so much, Miigwech.
That is all the time we have for Face to Face this week. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca, or visiting our APTN News YouTube page. Of course, this episode and all of our past episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those wherever you download your podcasts. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you back here in 7 days.